I used to think being strong meant staying quiet. I thought it meant swallowing pain, nodding along, and telling everyone I was fine, even when I wasn't. Especially when I wasn't. I was the guy people leaned on. The one who fixed things. The one who showed up without being asked. The strong son. The reliable brother. The man who never broke. That's what they called me. Strong. But nobody ever asked how heavy that word felt when I carried it alone. The night everything changed didn't start with shouting or violence. It started with silence. The kind that creeps into your chest and sits there, making your breathing feel louder than it should. The kind that makes you notice the hum of the fridge, the ticking clock, the way your own heartbeat feels like it's judging you. I remember sitting in my car outside my parents' house, hands on the steering wheel, engine off, just staring at the front door. I had been there for almost 20 minutes. I kept telling myself to go in. I kept telling myself this was just another family dinner. Just another night of smiling, listening, being the calm one. But something in my gut felt wrong. I didn't know yet that this would be the night I'd finally see my family clearly. Not the version I defended for years. Not the version I made excuses for. The real one. The one that would leave me feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. I had spent my whole life believing that if I stayed strong long enough, things would eventually balance out. That sacrifice would be noticed. That love would come back around. That being the good son would matter. I was wrong. And the worst part wasn't what they said that night. It was what they didn't say for all the years before. Growing up, my family loved telling people how lucky they were to have me. My mom would smile and say, "He never complains." My dad would nod and add, "He's tough. Always has been." My younger siblings would joke that I was like a second parent. At first, I was proud of that. It felt good to be needed. But over time, pride turned into habit. And habit turned into expectation. And expectation turned into a quiet kind of prison I didn't know how to escape. I learned early that my feelings came last. When money was tight, I was the one who got less. When someone needed help, I was the one who stepped in. When arguments happened, I was the one who stayed calm and made peace. I told myself this was just what men do. This was what being strong looked like. I didn't realize I was slowly disappearing. That night, I finally walked into the house. The smell of food hit me first. Familiar. Safe. My mom's cooking always had a way of making everything feel normal, even when it wasn't. Everyone was already there. My dad at the head of the table. My brother scrolling on his phone. My sister laughing about something I had missed. Nobody noticed how tense I was. Nobody asked if I was okay. Dinner started like it always did. Small talk. Jokes. Complaints about work. I listened more than I spoke. That was my role. I watched their faces, their gestures, the way they leaned toward each other. And for the first time, I noticed something I had ignored for years. I was always slightly outside the circle. Then my dad cleared his throat. He said my name in that serious tone that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. And in that moment, I knew something was coming. Something big. Something that would test how strong I really was. What he said next didn't sound cruel. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. But it cracked something inside me that had been holding together for decades. As he spoke, I felt the weight of every sacrifice I had made pressed down on my chest. Every time I chose family over myself. Every dream I postponed. Every boundary I never set. I realized, sitting there at that table, that I had trained them to see me as unbreakable. And because of that, they never learned how to protect me. That was the night I stopped being the strong son. Not because I finally broke down crying, but because I finally understood how alone I had been all along. I wasn't born strong. That's something people don't understand. Strength isn't something you wake up with one day. It's something that slowly grows around you, like a wall you didn't plan to build, but kept adding bricks to because no one else would. When I think back to my childhood, I don't remember big dramatic moments. No single disaster. No one night that changed everything. What I remember instead is a long line of small moments. Quiet ones. Moments that taught me who I was supposed to be in this family. I was the oldest. That fact alone came with a kind of invisible contract. Nobody ever sat me down and explained it. Nobody said, "This is what we expect from you." It was just understood. I watched how my parents moved, how they spoke, how they reacted when things went wrong. And I adjusted. My dad worked long hours. He wasn't a bad man. He was tired. Always tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones and makes you short-tempered without meaning to be. When he came home, the house shifted. Voices lowered. Movement slowed. We all learned how to stay out of his way. My mom held everything together. At least that's how it looked from the outside. She cooked, cleaned, managed schedules, paid bills, worried about everything, and somehow still smiled in front of other people. But behind closed doors, I saw the cracks. Late nights at the kitchen table. Quiet crying she thought no one heard. The way her hands shook when she opened mail. I learned early that my job was to make things easier for her. When my siblings were loud, I calmed them down. When my parents argued, I distracted everyone else. When money got tight, I pretended I didn't need things. New shoes, school trips, birthday gifts. I told myself those were wants, not needs. Nobody asked me to do that. I just did it. At school, teachers liked me. I was polite, responsible, mature for my age. That phrase followed me everywhere. You're so mature. Adults said it like it was a compliment, like it was a gift. But maturity at that age isn't wisdom. It's survival. I didn't cause trouble. I didn't ask for attention. I didn't push boundaries. I learned how to read rooms before I learned how to fully understand my own feelings. I knew when to speak and when to stay quiet. I knew when to step in and when to step back. At home, my siblings leaned on me without realizing it. My brother came to me with problems he didn't want to bring to our parents. My sister followed my lead in everything, watching how I acted before deciding how she should act. I like being needed. That's the part that's hard to admit. Being the strong one gave me purpose. It gave me a role. It made me feel important in a way that didn't require asking for anything. I told myself this was love. This was family. This was what good sons did. But there was a quiet cost I didn't notice at first. No one checked on me. When I had bad days, I kept them to myself. When I felt overwhelmed, I swallowed it. When I failed at something, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to add to the weight everyone else was already carrying. Over time, that silence became normal. I remember one night in high school. I had failed an exam I studied hard for. It crushed me more than I expected. I sat on my bed staring at the wall, feeling stupid and small. I wanted to talk to someone, just to say, hey, I'm not okay. But I didn't. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself I'd do better next time. I told myself this was my problem to solve. And just like that, another brick went up. By the time I graduated, being strong wasn't something I tried to be. It was who I was. College was the same story, just louder. More responsibility. More expectations. I worked part-time jobs to help out at home. I sent money back when I could. I skipped social stuff to save cash. When my parents needed help with paperwork or decisions, they called me. Not because I was the smartest, but because I was reliable. That word followed me into adulthood like a shadow. Reliable. Dependable. Solid. I built my life around those labels. When I started working full-time, I didn't chase my dreams. I chased stability. A steady paycheck. Health insurance. Something that wouldn't shake the ground under my family. I told myself dreams could wait. Dreams were optional. Responsibility wasn't. My siblings went after what they wanted, and I encouraged them. I told them to follow their passions, to take risks, to live their lives. I meant it. I just didn't include myself in that advice. As years passed, the pattern stayed the same. If someone needed help moving, I showed up. If someone needed money, I figured it out. If someone messed up, I smoothed it over. And every time I did, the expectation grew. It became normal that I would handle things. Normal that I wouldn't complain. Normal that my life would bend around everyone else's needs. The scary part is how invisible that becomes. You don't wake up one day feeling trapped. You wake up feeling tired. And you assume that's just adulthood. Family gatherings started to feel different as I got older. I noticed how decisions were made without asking me, but with the assumption that I'd support them anyway. I noticed how plans included my help, but not my input. If I said yes, it was appreciated. If I hesitated, it was questioned. I brushed off the discomfort, told myself I was overthinking it. Families aren't perfect. Everyone sacrifices. That's just how it goes. But deep down, something was shifting. I started to feel less like a son and more like a resource. When my parents talked about the future, they spoke as if I would always be there. As if my time, money, and energy were guaranteed. They didn't say it with malice. They said it with comfort. And that scared me more than anger ever could. Because comfort means no one plans to change. I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know how to ask for space without feeling guilty. I didn't know how to explain that being strong all the time was slowly breaking me. So I stayed quiet. Again, by the time that dinner happened, the one that changed everything, This pattern had been running for decades. Long enough that no one questioned it. Long enough that I barely questioned it myself. I walked into that house not just as a son, but as a role I had been playing my whole life. I just didn't know yet that they were about to test how much I was willing to give. And for the first time, I wouldn't be able to pretend it didn't hurt. Looking back now, I can see the signs were always there. They were small at first, easy to ignore. A comment here, a decision made without me there. A quiet assumption that I would handle things, pay for things, fix things. I told myself that was just how families worked. Someone always carried more weight than the others. That someone was me. After that dinner started, after my dad cleared his throat and said my name, the room felt different. Heavy, not tense in a loud way. More like the air itself had thickened. Everyone sat a little straighter. Even my brother finally put his phone down. My dad didn't look angry. He looked practical, like a man discussing numbers at work. He started talking about the future, about retirement, about the house, about what would happen down the road. He used phrases like long-term planning and family responsibility. I nodded along at first. That was my habit. I assumed this was another conversation where I'd listen, agree, and quietly take on whatever role was handed to me. Then he said something that made my chest tighten. He talked about how much my siblings still needed support, how the world was hard, how they had struggled, how they deserved stability. He talked about sacrifices that had to be made. And then he looked at me, not with gratitude, with expectation. He said it made sense for certain responsibilities to fall on me. He didn't ask if I was okay with it. He explained it like it was already decided, like it was obvious. My mom nodded beside him. She didn't look at me. She stared at the table like she was afraid of what she might see on my face. My brother stayed quiet. My sister avoided my eyes. That's when I realized this conversation had happened before, just not with me in the room. My dad explained that they had decided to restructure things. Financial support, property plans, future care. He said it calmly, like he was laying out a budget. The more he talked, the clearer it became. They expected me to give more. Again, more money, more time, more responsibility, with fewer guarantees, fewer boundaries, less acknowledgement. And the worst part wasn't that they asked. It was how normal it felt to them. I felt something rise in my throat. Not anger. Not yet. More like disbelief. I had spent my entire life stepping up without being asked. And now, when it really mattered, I wasn't even included in the decision. I finally spoke. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Too quiet. Too controlled. I asked a simple question. What about me? The room went silent. Not the thoughtful kind of silence. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that tells you you've said something unexpected. Something inconvenient. My dad frowned slightly, like he didn't understand the question. What do you mean? He asked. I explained. Slowly. Carefully. I talked about my own plans. My own stress. My own limits. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I just told the truth. That was my mistake. Because honesty changes the rules of a room. My dad sighed. He said I was overthinking. He said I was strong. He said I could handle it. He said my siblings needed it more. That phrase hit harder than anything else that night. Needed it more. Like my needs were optional. Like my life was extra. Like strength meant I didn't qualify for care. My mom finally spoke then. She said she didn't mean it that way. She said she appreciated everything I'd done. She said this wasn't about favoritism. It was about practicality. Practicality. That word felt cold. I looked at my siblings, hoping for something. Support. Understanding. Even discomfort. My brother shrugged and said, "You've always been better at this stuff." My sister said, "You're the responsible one." That was it. Years of sacrifice reduced to a personality trait. I felt something shift inside me, like a door quietly closing. I realized they didn't see my sacrifices as choices. They saw them as traits, as natural facts about who I was, like the color of my eyes or the sound of my voice. And facts don't get thanked. They get used. I tried one more time to explain. I talked about how tired I was, how overwhelmed I felt, how I wanted a life that wasn't built entirely around holding everyone else up. My dad's expression hardened. He said something I'll never forget. He said, "That's just not who you are." In that moment, I understood something painful. They didn't love me for who I was becoming. They loved me for what I provided. The conversation ended without resolution. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just quiet disappointment hanging in the air. I left that house feeling hollow. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't call anyone. I just drove, staring at the road, replaying the night over and over in my head. I kept asking myself if I was selfish, if I had failed them, if I was breaking some unspoken rule. But underneath all that guilt was a deeper truth I couldn't ignore anymore. I had been betraying myself for years. And that night, my family made it clear they expected me to keep doing it. The days after were worse than the dinner itself. No one called to check on me. No one asked how I felt. They acted like everything was normal, like the conversation was settled. That hurt more than the argument ever could have. It told me they assumed I'd fall back into place. I started pulling away without meaning to, answering messages slower, visiting less, saying, "I'm busy," when I wasn't. And for the first time in my life, no one chased me. That's when the fear set in. Not fear of losing them. Fear of realizing how conditional their love might be. I lay awake at night questioning everything. Wondering if strength was just another word for silence. Wondering how many parts of myself I had buried just to keep the peace. I wasn't angry yet. I was grieving. Grieving the family I thought I had. Grieving the version of myself I had sacrificed. Grieving the belief that if I gave enough, I'd be protected in return. That belief was gone now. And in its place was a question I couldn't escape. If I stopped being the strong son, who would I be to them? After that dinner, something inside me went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Not relief. It was the kind of quiet that happens after a long noise finally stops, and you realize how exhausted you are from hearing it. I went through my days on autopilot. Work. Home. Sleep. Repeat. I smiled when people talked to me. I answered when my family called. I showed up when I was expected to. But I wasn't really there. I stopped offering help before anyone asked. That was new for me. It felt wrong. Like leaving a door unlocked. Every instinct in my body told me to step in, fix things, smooth things over. But I didn't. I waited. And the waiting showed me something I wasn't ready to see. When I didn't jump in right away, things still happened. Plans were made. Decisions were taken. Life moved on. And no one checked why I was quieter. No one noticed the shift unless it affected them directly. That realization sat heavy in my chest. I started thinking about all the times I had pushed my own feelings aside. The job offers I didn't take because they were too risky. The relationships I let fade because I didn't have the energy to explain my family obligations. The weekends I gave up. The money I handed over without question. I told myself I was doing the right thing. But right for who? One night, weeks after that dinner, my mom called me late. Her voice sounded tired. Familiar. She talked about bills. About stress. About how everything felt like it was piling up again. I listened. Of course I did. Then she paused. She said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." That sentence used to make me feel proud. This time, it made my stomach twist. Because what she meant was not love. It was dependence. I realized I had become a safety net so wide that no one bothered to learn how to land on their own feet. And somehow, I was the one expected to stretch further every time they fell. I didn't say no that night. I wasn't ready. I still sent the money. Still reassured her. Still told her everything would be okay. But after I hung up, I sat alone in my living room and felt something crack. I felt invisible. Not unseen. Invisible. Like my presence only mattered when it was useful. Like my worth was measured by how much weight I could carry without collapsing. I started asking myself questions I had avoided my whole life. What do I want? What do I need? What happens if I stop? Those questions scared me more than any argument ever had. Because deep down, I knew the answers would change everything. The breaking point didn't come in a dramatic explosion. It came in a quiet moment, alone, when no one was watching. I was cleaning out an old drawer one weekend and found a notebook from years ago. Dreams I had written down. Plans I never followed. Places I wanted to go. Things I wanted to try. I barely recognized the man who wrote those words. He sounded hopeful, curious, alive. I sat on the floor and read page after page, feeling like I was reading someone else's life. A life I had slowly abandoned without even realizing it. That's when the tears came. Not loud, not messy, just steady, heavy, the kind that feels like grief more than sadness. I cried for the version of myself that believed being good meant being silent. I cried for every time I told myself I didn't matter as much as everyone else. I cried because I didn't know how to exist outside the role I had been playing for so long. And for the first time, I admitted something I had never allowed myself to say out loud. I was tired of being strong. The next family gathering felt different before it even started. I noticed how my chest tightened as I drove over. how my hands shook slightly when I parked. My body knew what my mind was still trying to deny. Inside, everything looked the same. Same furniture, same smells, same voices. But I wasn't the same. The conversation drifted toward future plans again. Not aggressively, casually, like they assumed we were all on the same page now. I felt the pressure build in my chest. And then, without planning to, I said it. I can't do that anymore. The room froze. I explained myself as calmly as I could. I said I needed boundaries. I said I needed space. I said I needed to start thinking about my own life. No accusations. No yelling. Just truth. My dad looked stunned. My mom looked hurt. My siblings looked confused. My mom asked if I was mad at them. That question almost broke me, because it showed how little they understood. This wasn't about anger. It was about survival. I told them I wasn't mad. I told them I loved them. I told them I just couldn't keep living this way. The reaction wasn't explosive. It was worse. They were disappointed. Not concerned. Not curious. Disappointed. Like I had failed a test they never told me I was taking. After that, the distance became real. Calls slowed down. Invitations became less frequent. When we did talk, it felt careful, polite, shallow. I felt like I was being punished for choosing myself, and the guilt nearly pulled me back in. I questioned everything. Wondered if I was being selfish, if I was abandoning them, if strength meant enduring no matter the cost. But then I remembered that notebook. That man who believed his life could be more than obligation. And I held on to that memory like a lifeline. The fall wasn't loud. It was lonely. It was realizing that when I stopped holding everyone up, no one rushed to hold me. It was learning that some people only love the version of you that makes their lives easier. And that truth hurt more than any argument ever could. For a long time after I set those boundaries, I lived in a strange in-between space. I wasn't fully free, but I wasn't fully trapped anymore either. It felt like standing in a doorway, unsure which side I belonged on. My family was still there, technically, still alive, still connected to me by blood. But something had shifted, and none of us knew how to talk about it. Silence became the new language. At first, I told myself that distance was healthy, that this was just an adjustment period, that everyone needed time. I tried to stay busy, took extra hours at work, filled my weekends with errands and distractions, anything to avoid sitting still with my thoughts. But when life finally slowed down, the realization started creeping in. I noticed how rarely my phone buzzed now, how weeks could pass without a single check-in. I noticed how family news reached me late, like an afterthought. I noticed how conversations stayed surface level, like we were all afraid of stepping on something sharp. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand something. They weren't waiting for me to come back. They were waiting for me to fold. That truth hit me one night while scrolling through old messages. I was looking for something specific. I didn't know what. Maybe proof that I mattered more than I felt. Maybe reassurance that I wasn't imagining things. What I found instead was a pattern. Years of conversations where I was the one checking in, the one asking questions, the one offering help, the one smoothing over tension, the one saying, "It's okay," even when it wasn't. When I stopped doing that, the connection thinned almost immediately. Not because they didn't love me, but because love had been built on my effort. That realization was brutal. I had always believed our bond was strong because it was unconditional. But now I could see how much of it depended on my willingness to carry the load without complaint. I started replaying memories through this new lens. The praise I used to get for being strong. The jokes about me being the reliable one. The assumptions that I would always be there. None of it was malicious. But none of it was fair either. I remembered something my dad said years ago, during a tough time. He had clapped me on the shoulder and said, "I don't worry about you. You always land on your feet." At the time, that felt like confidence. Now, it felt like permission to forget about me. The twist wasn't discovering they had wronged me on purpose. The twist was realizing they had never truly seen me as someone who needed care too. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with grief. A deep, hollow grief that settled into my chest and refused to leave. I wasn't losing my family. I was losing the illusion of who I thought I was to them. There was one moment that sealed it. My brother called me one afternoon. His voice sounded rushed. Distracted. He talked about a problem he was having. Something stressful. Something urgent. For a few minutes, I listened. Old instincts kicked in. I felt the urge to fix it. To offer solutions. To take responsibility. Then I paused. I told him I couldn't help this time. Not because I didn't care, but because I was overwhelmed myself. There was silence on the line. Then he said, "Oh, okay, I'll figure it out." No concern, no follow-up, no question about why. The call ended quickly, and I sat there staring at my phone, realizing how easy it was for them to move on when I didn't perform my role. That was the moment the truth fully settled in. I wasn't loved less now. I was needed less. And those are two very different kinds of pain. I began to understand that my identity had been built around being useful. When that usefulness was removed, there wasn't much left for them to connect with. That forced me to ask myself a hard question. If I'm not the strong one, who am I? At first, that question terrified me. I had no answer. I had spent so long defining myself by what I gave that I didn't know who I was without it. My routines felt empty. My days felt strangely quiet. I felt selfish for enjoying the peace and guilty for enjoying it at the same time. But slowly, something unexpected happened. I started to feel lighter. Not happy. Not yet. But lighter. I noticed I slept better. I noticed my shoulders weren't always tense. I noticed I could make decisions without running them through a mental checklist of who they might affect. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me. That scared me too. Because claiming your own life means accepting responsibility for it. No hiding behind duty. No blaming obligation. No easy excuses. Just you and your choices. I started doing small things for myself. Nothing dramatic. Going for walks without a destination. Saying no without explaining. Letting calls go unanswered when I needed rest. Each small choice felt like rebellion. And also like healing. I still loved my family. That never changed. But love, I was learning, didn't have to mean self-erasure. The biggest realization came quietly, one evening, as I sat alone watching the sun go down. I felt a strange mix of sadness and peace. And I finally understood something I wish I had known much earlier. Being strong doesn't mean being silent. Being good doesn't mean being empty. And love that costs you your entire self is not love. It's obligation. That was the twist. Not betrayal. Not revenge. But awakening. I hadn't lost my family. I had found myself. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. After that realization settled in, life didn't suddenly become easy. That's something people don't tell you about growth. There's this idea that once you understand the truth, everything clicks into place. That peace arrives like a reward. But real change doesn't feel like a victory at first. It feels like learning how to walk without a shield you've worn your entire life. I didn't know how to exist without being the strong one. For years, strength had been my armor. It protected me from disappointment, from conflict, from asking for things that might not be given. Without it, I felt exposed. Raw, like everyone could suddenly see how unsure I really was. I started noticing how often I reached for my phone out of habit. Not to call anyone, just to check, to see if someone needed me, to see if I was still useful. Most of the time, there was nothing. That emptiness was uncomfortable. I didn't know what to do with it. I had spent so long filling every quiet moment with responsibility that silence felt like failure. But slowly, I began to sit with it. I let evenings stretch out without plans. I let weekends pass without fixing someone else's problems. I let myself be bored. And in that boredom, something unexpected started to happen. I began to hear my own thoughts. They weren't loud or dramatic. They were simple, honest, sometimes awkward, sometimes sad, sometimes hopeful in a way I hadn't felt in years. I realized how much of my life had been lived in reaction mode, responding, adjusting, compromising. I had rarely asked myself what I actually wanted because there was always someone else who needed something first. Now, there was space, and space forces questions. What kind of life do I want? What kind of man do I want to be? Who am I when no one is leaning on me? Those questions didn't have immediate answers. Some days they made me anxious. Other days they made me curious. But they were mine. At the same time, my relationship with my family stayed distant. Not hostile, just quiet. Polite messages on birthdays. Short calls on holidays. No deep conversations. No real check-ins. I noticed something strange about that distance. It hurt less than I expected. Not because I didn't care, but because the constant pressure was gone. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next request, the next expectation, and that absence gave me clarity. I started seeing how often love in my family had been confused with duty, how often affection came wrapped in need, how rarely anyone asked how I was doing unless it led somewhere useful. This wasn't about blame. I wasn't angry at them. They were doing what they had learned, just like I had. But understanding that didn't mean I had to keep participating in the same pattern. One afternoon, my mom finally asked to meet. Just the two of us. Coffee. Neutral ground. Her voice on the phone sounded careful, like she was walking across thin ice. When I saw her sitting there, hands folded around her cup, she looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. We talked about safe things at first. Weather. Work. Distant relatives. The usual. Then she looked at me and asked, "Are you okay?" It was the first time she had asked that in years. I didn't know how to answer. The honest answer was complicated. I was better. I was hurting. I was healing. I was learning. All at the same time. So I told her the truth, gently. I said I was figuring things out. I said I needed time. I said I loved her, but I needed to live differently now. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully understand. She said she missed how close we used to be. That sentence stung, because closeness, in our family, had often meant access. Access to my time, my energy, my sacrifices. I told her I missed parts of it too, but I also told her I couldn't go back to being the person I was. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She just looked sad, and that sadness stayed with me long after we said goodbye. That was one of the hardest lessons of all. Sometimes, choosing yourself hurts people you love, not because you're wrong, but because the version of you they depended on no longer exists. I had to learn to live with that. There were nights I questioned everything. Nights when guilt crept in and whispered that I was selfish, that I had abandoned my role, that strength meant endurance, not boundaries. But then I would remember how empty I felt before, how invisible, how tired, and I knew I couldn't go back. I began building a life that felt quieter, but more honest. I paid attention to my health, my rest, my emotions, things I had ignored for years because they didn't feel urgent. I let myself want things again. Not huge dreams, just small ones. Peace, balance, connection that didn't feel like a transaction. I started opening up to people outside my family, friends, co-workers, even strangers sometimes. I practiced saying how I felt without apologizing for it. It was awkward at first, uncomfortable, but it was real. And slowly, I felt myself becoming whole again. I didn't stop being strong. I just stopped confusing strength with silence. Strength, I learned, can look like rest, like honesty, like walking away from roles that cost you your soul. I still love my family. That will never change. But love doesn't mean losing yourself. It doesn't mean carrying everyone else while you disappear. The strong son I used to be kept everything together. The man I'm becoming is learning how to stand without breaking himself in the process. And that lesson, as painful as it was, saved my life in ways I'm still discovering. There's a strange loneliness that comes after you choose yourself. It isn't the loud kind. It doesn't scream or beg for attention. It shows up quietly, in moments you didn't expect. Like when you realize no one is calling to ask for your opinion anymore. Or when you notice that your absence didn't cause the collapse you feared it would. Life just kept going. At first, that realization hurt more than anything else. I had spent years believing that if I stepped back, everything would fall apart. That I was the glue holding things together. That my presence was essential. Seeing the world continue without me in that role forced me to face a hard truth. I had overestimated my importance in some ways, and underestimated my right to live freely. That balance was difficult to accept. Some days, I missed the feeling of being needed. Not because it was healthy, but because it was familiar. Need had been my language, my proof of worth. Without it, I felt untethered, like I was floating without direction. But with time, I noticed something else. The people who reached out now did so differently. They didn't call because they needed something fixed. They called to talk, to share, to check in. Those calls were fewer, but they felt more real, more human. I began to see the difference between being relied on and being valued. Reliance drains you. Value meets you halfway. One evening, a friend asked how I was really doing. No agenda, no follow-up request, just curiosity. I froze for a second, unsure how to answer. Then I told him the truth. I told him about the exhaustion, the guilt, the fear of disappointing people, the strange peace that came with distance. I talked longer than I meant to. He listened, didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anything. When I finished, he said, "Man, that sounds heavy. I'm glad you're taking care of yourself." That was it. No advice, no expectations. I sat there afterward, stunned by how simple it felt to be heard. That moment taught me something powerful. Support doesn't always come from the people you expect. And sometimes, the strongest connections are the ones built without obligation. Meanwhile, my family continued to adjust to the new version of me. Some adjusted slowly. Some resisted quietly. Some never really adjusted at all. My dad remained distant. Conversations stayed short. Practical. Focused on logistics. He didn't bring up the past, and neither did I. There was an unspoken agreement to avoid the topic entirely. My mom tried in her own way. She asked how work was going, how my health was, but there was always a hesitation, like she was afraid of crossing an invisible line. My siblings reached out less often, and when they did, it was brief. At first, I took it personally. Then I realized something important. They were learning how to live without leaning on me. That wasn't a failure. It was growth. For all of us. I had to let go of the idea that love meant constant closeness. That family had to look a certain way. That distance always meant loss. Sometimes, distance is what allows respect to grow. I also had to face my own habits. Even after setting boundaries, I caught myself wanting to jump in, wanting to rescue, wanting to smooth things over. Letting go of that urge was harder than setting the boundary in the first place. Because rescuing people feels good in the moment. It gives you purpose. It quiets your own discomfort. But long term, it keeps everyone stuck. I learned to pause instead, to ask myself, am I helping or am I avoiding my own feelings? That question saved me more times than I can count. There were moments I failed, times I stepped in when I shouldn't have, times I gave more than I could afford emotionally. When that happened, I didn't punish myself. I reminded myself that unlearning a lifetime of patterns takes time. Healing isn't clean. It's messy. It doubles back on itself. And that's okay. I also started noticing how my sense of identity was changing. I wasn't introducing myself as the reliable one anymore. I wasn't defining my worth by productivity or sacrifice. I was learning how to just be. That felt awkward at first. Almost lazy. Like I was breaking some invisible rule. But slowly it felt right. I began to enjoy mornings without urgency. Evenings without obligation. Conversations that didn't lead to requests. I noticed how much calmer my body felt. How my breathing was deeper. How my thoughts weren't constantly racing ahead to the next problem. I hadn't realized how much stress I carried until it was gone. One night, lying in bed, I thought about the younger version of myself. The kid who learned early to stay quiet. To be helpful. To be strong. I wished I could tell him something. I wished I could tell him that strength doesn't mean disappearing. That love doesn't have to hurt. That being needed isn't the same as being cherished. Most of all, I wished I could tell him that it's okay to take up space. I couldn't change the past, but I could honor it by living differently now. That became my quiet promise to myself. To show up fully. To speak honestly. To rest without guilt. To let people meet me where I am, instead of where they want me to be. And if they couldn't do that, to let them go with compassion instead of resentment. That choice didn't make me weak. It made me free. There comes a point in healing where you realize something quietly powerful. You don't need everyone to understand you. For a long time, I thought clarity would come from explanation, from sitting everyone down and carefully laying out my reasons, from finding the perfect words that would finally make them see what I had been carrying all these years. But that moment never came. And slowly, I understood why. People who benefit from your silence rarely ask why you're tired of being quiet. Once I accepted that, something inside me relaxed. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. Stopped imagining how I would defend my choices if someone challenged them. Stopped preparing speeches no one had asked to hear. I didn't know anyone a version of myself that hurt just to keep them comfortable. That realization felt like exhaling after holding my breath for decades. I noticed how often I had explained myself in the past, even for small things. Why I couldn't help this weekend. Why I needed rest. Why I had plans of my own. Every no came wrapped in apologies and context, like I needed permission to exist. I stopped doing that. Not out of anger. Out of respect for myself. No became a complete sentence. At first, it felt rude. Unnatural. My chest would tighten after saying it, waiting for the backlash. Waiting for disappointment. Waiting for guilt to flood in. Sometimes it did. But more often, nothing happened. And that taught me something important. Most of the pressure I felt had been internal. I had been policing myself long before anyone else had to. Around this time, memories from my childhood started resurfacing in a different way. Not as nostalgia, not as pain, but as information. I began to see moments I had normalized for years. Times when I was praised for not needing help. Times when my emotions were dismissed because I handled things well. Times when I was overlooked because I didn't make noise. Those moments hadn't made me strong. They had trained me to disappear politely. That wasn't anyone's intention. But intention doesn't erase impact. Understanding that allowed me to feel compassion without self-blame. I didn't fail myself on purpose. I adapted the best way I knew how. And now, I was choosing something different. There was one afternoon when my dad and I ended up alone together for the first time in a long while. No big setup. No planned talk. Just circumstance. We sat across from each other, the silence thick but not hostile. He asked how work was going. I answered. He nodded. Then he said something unexpected. You seem different. I didn't know what he meant at first. Different could mean anything. So I asked him. He paused, then said, calmer, quieter, like you don't need to prove anything anymore. That hit me harder than I expected, because he was right. I told him I had been learning to slow down, to listen to myself more. He nodded again, then said, that's probably good. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission, but it was acknowledgement. And that was enough. I realized then that closure doesn't always come in the form we imagine. Sometimes it comes as a small moment of recognition, a subtle shift, a quiet acceptance. I didn't need him to say he was wrong. I didn't need him to understand everything. I just needed to stop needing it. As time went on, I grew more comfortable with the new rhythm of my life. I made choices without checking how they might land with everyone else first. I invested energy where it was returned. I stopped chasing approval that never came freely. That changed how I saw relationships altogether. I became more selective. Not colder, just clearer. I paid attention to how people made me feel after spending time with them. Drained or steady, anxious or grounded, seen or invisible. Those signals mattered now. I also learned how to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. When guilt showed up, I didn't immediately obey it. I asked where it came from, whose voice it sounded like, whether it actually belonged to me. Most of the time, it didn't. That was another hard truth. Not every uncomfortable feeling is a sign you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's a sign you're doing something new. Growth has a way of feeling like loss before it feels like freedom. I thought often about the phrase, strong son, how proudly it had been used, how deeply it had shaped me. I didn't reject that part of myself. I just redefined it. Strength, I learned, is not endless giving. It's discernment. It's knowing when to step in and when to step back. It's letting others struggle so they can grow. And it's trusting that your worth doesn't disappear when you stop performing. One evening, I caught myself smiling for no reason. Just sitting there, content. No urgency. No guilt. That's when I realized something subtle but important. Peace had replaced vigilance. I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I wasn't scanning the room for needs I could meet. I was just present. That presence felt like a gift I had waited my whole life to open. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't have everything figured out. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. Because the life ahead of me was finally mine. There is a moment in every long emotional journey where you stop running. Not because you've reached the end, but because you no longer have the energy to avoid what's been waiting for you. For me, that moment came quietly. I was sitting alone one night, lights off, city noise drifting through the window. No music, no phone, just me and the thoughts I had been slowly circling for months. I wasn't sad exactly. I wasn't calm either. I was open, and that openness scared me more than any conflict ever had. For years, I had survived by staying busy, by focusing outward, by solving problems that weren't mine. Now there was nowhere left to hide. No one else's crisis to manage. No role to play. Just me. That's when the feelings I had postponed started lining up, one by one, asking to be acknowledged. Grief came first. Not dramatic grief. Not sobbing on the floor grief. It was the quiet kind that sits in your chest and makes everything feel heavier than it should. Grief for the childhood I never fully had. For the emotional safety I didn't realize I was missing. For the version of family I believed in for so long. I grieved the man I might have been if I had learned earlier that I mattered too. That grief didn't accuse anyone. It didn't demand answers. It just existed. And I let it. Then came anger. That surprised me. I had spent so long avoiding anger, afraid it would turn me into someone I didn't recognize. But this anger wasn't loud. It didn't want revenge. It wanted acknowledgement. It was angry that my silence had been mistaken for strength instead of pain. Angry that my reliability had made me invisible. Angry that no one noticed how much I was giving until I stopped. I didn't act on that anger. I didn't throw it at anyone. I just let myself feel it without judgment. And then, underneath all of that, came compassion. For myself. That was the hardest part. I realized how harsh I had been with myself for years. How quickly I dismissed my own needs. How often I told myself to just deal with it, because others had it worse. I had confused minimizing my pain with maturity. In that quiet room, I finally said something out loud that I had never allowed myself to say before. This was hard for me. Saying it didn't make me weak. It made me honest. I began reflecting on specific moments from my past, seeing them clearly for the first time. Not through the lens of duty, but through the lens of humanity. The times I wanted comfort but didn't ask. The times I felt overwhelmed but kept smiling. The times I was praised for being easy, when what I really was quiet. I didn't blame my parents for everything. They had their own wounds, their own limits. But I stopped excusing the impact those limits had on me. Both things could be true. That realization brought a strange sense of balance. I wasn't a victim, but I wasn't unheard either. Holding those two truths at the same time changed how I saw my story. As weeks passed, I noticed how this internal reckoning affected my daily life. I was more patient, not because I was suppressing frustration, but because I wasn't carrying as much of it. I reacted less. I listened more, not out of obligation, but out of choice. I also noticed how I no longer felt the need to explain myself to my family. When they asked why I couldn't do something, I didn't launch into reasons. I just said I wasn't available. When they expressed disappointment, I didn't rush to fix it. I let them have their feelings. That was new and freeing. There was a moment when my sister finally asked me directly if something was wrong between us. Her voice sounded unsure, almost vulnerable. I paused before answering. Then I told her the truth. Not everything. Not a list of grievances. Just the core. I said I had spent a long time being who everyone needed me to be. And now I was learning how to be myself. That it wasn't about pushing anyone away. It was about staying whole. She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "I never knew you felt that way." I believed her. And in that moment, I understood something important. Being unseen doesn't always mean being unloved. Sometimes it means being misunderstood. That didn't erase the past, but it softened it. I wasn't seeking apologies anymore. I wasn't waiting for recognition. I was allowing myself to move forward without dragging the need for validation behind me. That shift felt like turning a heavy page. I started thinking about the future in a different way. Not as a series of obligations to fulfill, but as a landscape I was allowed to explore. Slowly, intentionally, I thought about relationships, about what kind of partner I wanted to be someday. One who didn't disappear into service. One who knew how to receive care as well as give it. I thought about family and how it might evolve. Not disappear, just change shape. I thought about the word strong and how little it meant without softness to balance it. Strength without softness is just endurance. And endurance alone will wear you down. One night, I wrote a letter I never sent. It was addressed to my younger self. I told him he didn't need to earn love by carrying everything. That he was allowed to rest. That one day, he would learn how to put himself first without losing his heart. Writing that letter felt like closing a circle. I wasn't trying to rewrite my past. I was honoring it. And that, more than anything, helped me let go. The reckoning didn't fix everything. Some relationships remained distant. Some misunderstandings never fully cleared. Some moments still hurt when I thought about them too long. But the pain no longer defined me. It informed me. And that made all the difference. For a long time, I thought family was something you endured. You showed up. You stayed quiet. You did what was expected. And in return, you belonged. That was the deal, whether anyone ever said it out loud or not. But as I moved further away from the version of myself that lived only for obligation, I started to question that deal. Not in anger, in curiosity. What if family wasn't supposed to feel heavy all the time? What if love wasn't meant to feel like something you owed? Those questions didn't come with answers right away. They showed up in small moments. In the way my shoulders stayed relaxed during conversations that used to make me tense. In the way I no longer felt a spike of anxiety when my phone rang. I noticed how different my body felt now that I wasn't constantly bracing for requests. That physical change mattered more than I expected. It told me I had been living in a low-level state of stress for most of my life. Always ready, always alert, always prepared to sacrifice something without being asked. Letting go of that wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. And that quiet gave me room to rethink everything I thought I knew about family. I started to see that my parents hadn't intentionally shaped me into the strong one. They had simply responded to the version of me that caused the least trouble. The one who didn't need much. The one who adapted. They had rewarded that behavior without realizing the cost. Understanding that didn't excuse the imbalance, but it softened the edges of my resentment. It allowed me to see them as people, not just roles, as flawed adults who were doing the best they could with what they had. At the same time, I stopped pretending that good intentions erased real harm. Both could exist. That balance became important to me. I didn't want to carry bitterness forward, but I also didn't want to erase myself again in the name of peace. So I began redefining what family meant to me. Family, I decided, was not about who needed me most. It was about where I felt safe being honest. That shift changed everything. I stopped measuring closeness by how much I gave. I started measuring it by how much I could be myself without shrinking. Some relationships didn't survive that test, and that hurt. There were moments when I missed the old version of closeness, the familiarity, the sense of purpose that came with being needed. Even when it drained me, it gave me identity. Letting go of that felt like letting go of a job I had worked my whole life without realizing I was employed. But as time passed, something new began to grow in that empty space. I noticed my conversations with my family slowly changing. Not all at once, not evenly, but subtly. They asked fewer things of me, and when they did, they asked instead of assumed. That alone felt like progress. I didn't jump at every opportunity to help. I considered. I checked in with myself. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I didn't. Either way, I didn't explain myself afterward. That boundary became an act of self-respect. There was one moment that stayed with me. My dad called me about a situation he used to automatically hand off to me. Something complicated. Something stressful. This time, he asked if I had the capacity. The question surprised me. I paused before answering. Felt into my body. Checked my energy. I told him I couldn't take it on right now. He didn't argue. He just said, "Okay, thanks for being honest." When the call ended, I sat there in silence, realizing how big that moment actually was. It wasn't about the task. It was about recognition. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm. That calm told me I was moving in the right direction. I also started building a sense of family outside of blood. People who knew me as I was now, not as I had been trained to be. Friends who didn't expect constant availability. People who noticed when I was tired. Who asked questions without needing solutions. Those relationships felt lighter, more balanced. And for the first time, I understood that family could be chosen. That didn't mean abandoning my roots. It meant expanding my understanding of belonging. I could love my family without being consumed by them. I could care without carrying. I could show up without disappearing. That was a powerful realization. It allowed me to be present without resentment, to listen without bracing, to offer support without losing myself in the process. I also began to forgive myself for the years I spent stuck in that old role. I had done what I knew how to do at the time. Now I knew better, and knowing better meant doing differently. That difference wasn't always comfortable. Sometimes it felt awkward. Sometimes it felt lonely. Sometimes it felt like standing still while others moved on without you. But it also felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, creates a kind of peace that obligation never can. As I rewrote my relationship with family, I also rewrote my relationship with myself. I stopped asking if I was doing enough. I started asking if I was doing what was true. That question became my compass, and it led me somewhere I had never been before. A life that felt like it belonged to me. The weeks and months after that quiet reckoning felt different in ways I couldn't always put into words. I began noticing small shifts in myself. How my mornings felt lighter. How I could make a simple decision without feeling like the weight of the world would collapse if I didn't. How I could smile without guilt. How I could breathe without bracing for the next expectation. It was subtle. Sometimes I would forget it, caught in the old rhythm of my mind. But it was always there, like the first glimpse of dawn over a city skyline. Gradual, persistent, undeniable. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the park bench near my apartment, watching kids play in the distance. Their laughter was pure and unburdened. No obligations. No expectations. Just joy. It reminded me of something I had lost touch with a long time ago. The freedom to feel completely alive without guilt. I realized I had spent so much of my life moving through the world as a caretaker, as the strong one, that I rarely let myself just be. That day, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would allow myself to live fully. Not in rebellion, not in spite, but in honesty. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand declaration to my family, no explosive confrontation. The strongest moments often aren't loud. They are silent, rooted in consistent choices that honor who you are. I began small. I stopped over-explaining my boundaries. I allowed myself to decline invitations that drained me. I started investing time in things that nourished me. Reading books I loved. Going for long walks. Learning things I'd always postponed because there wasn't time. And as I leaned into my own needs, something remarkable happened. I felt visible for the first time in years. Not in the sense that someone was watching me or praising me, but in the sense that I could see myself clearly. My worth was no longer conditional on what I gave or how I performed. It simply existed. I remembered the young man I used to be, the one who always carried the weight of everyone else's needs, who hid his own feelings behind calm smiles and quiet solutions. I felt tenderness for him. And finally, I forgave him. Forgiving myself for what I had believed I had to do, for what I had sacrificed, was one of the hardest things I had ever done. It wasn't instant. It wasn't a single thought. It was a process. One day, one moment at a time, I realized I didn't need to apologize for surviving, for trying, for loving in the way I knew how. That forgiveness opened the door to empathy for my family as well. Not excuses, not a rewrite of the past, but understanding. Recognizing that they, too, acted from their limitations. That their love was real, just expressed imperfectly. I began to see our dynamics more clearly, without the filter of guilt. The moments of tension no longer dictated my self-worth. The silences no longer made me question my value. I learned to love them, and myself, with gentleness. One evening, I called my sister. Not because I had to, not because there was a problem, but because I wanted to. We talked for hours. About small things. About memories. About dreams. About life. For the first time in decades, it felt like a conversation, not a performance. She didn't need me to fix anything. I didn't need to prove anything. We were simply two people sharing space, and that was enough. It struck me then that this was the essence of healthy connection. Love without debt, care without obligation, presence without surrender. I began applying this understanding to all relationships in my life. Friends, colleagues, neighbors. I noticed how much lighter interactions became when I didn't carry them out of fear, guilt, or obligation. When I showed up as myself, unhidden, unarmed with over-prepared strength, I was met in kind. And through it all, I discovered an unexpected truth. Vulnerability isn't weakness. Rest isn't failure. Saying no doesn't make you selfish. Choosing yourself is not betrayal, it's survival. I started keeping a small journal again, writing letters I didn't send. Reflections, memories, thoughts I wanted to remember. The act itself became a ritual of presence, a reminder that my inner life mattered, that my feelings were real, that my story counted. One rainy evening, as I walked home from work, I stopped in front of the cafe I used to frequent with my father. I thought about all the moments I had swallowed my own needs for the sake of family, all the nights I had lain awake, carrying invisible burdens. And then I smiled, quietly, because I realized that, finally, I had stopped carrying them alone. I had given myself permission to carry only what I could, to protect only what I could, and to let the rest unfold naturally. Strength had been redefined, not by endurance alone, not by obligation, but by choice, by honesty, by presence, by courage to honor my own life. It was a subtle transformation, but profound. The man who walked past that cafe that night wasn't the boy who believed silence was strength. He wasn't the son who sacrificed himself to keep everyone else whole. He was someone who understood that life is not about carrying everything. It's about knowing what is yours to carry and letting the rest go with grace. And in that grace, I found freedom. I never expected peace to feel this quiet. It's not the kind of peace you see in movies, with dramatic music and sudden revelations. It's subtler. It arrives in the small spaces between moments. The soft hum of your own thoughts. The freedom to breathe without anticipating someone else's needs. The ability to make a choice because it's right for you, not because someone expects it. In the months after I set boundaries and stopped defining myself solely as the strong son, I felt life differently. I noticed the little things, sunlight on the floor, the the warmth of coffee in my hands, the sound of rain against the window. Things I used to experience only in passing now had meaning because I wasn't distracted by endless responsibilities. I had built a life that belonged to me, step by step. And yet, I also realized that stepping back from family obligations didn't make me any less connected to them. I still loved my parents, my siblings. I still cared deeply. But love no longer meant self-erasure. I learned to give without losing myself, to be present without disappearing. That balance, elusive for years, was finally possible. I began reaching out differently. I called not out of obligation, but because I wanted to connect. I offered advice only when asked. I listened without rushing to solve. Conversations became genuine again. I noticed a subtle shift. My family began to adjust too. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that a new rhythm emerged. One where love was mutual, not transactional. That was the hardest lesson of all. Some people will take time to adjust, and some may never truly understand. And that's okay. Your growth doesn't depend on their recognition. Your worth doesn't require approval. I started thinking about all the years I had spent believing that silence was strength, that self-sacrifice was the measure of love, that carrying everyone else was my purpose. I carried invisible weights for decades, convincing myself that being needed equaled being loved. And it did, in its own way, but it came at the cost of my own life. My dreams, my rest, my joy. Now, I understood that being strong isn't enduring endlessly. Being strong is knowing your limits. Being strong is showing up for others while still showing up for yourself. It's the courage to be vulnerable, to say no, to choose yourself without fear. There were days I still questioned myself. Moments when guilt crept in, whispering that I was selfish, that I had failed somehow. But I had learned to pause, breathe, and reflect. I asked whether that guilt was mine or just old conditioning. Most of the time, it wasn't mine at all. Freedom, I discovered, doesn't mean leaving everything behind. It means stepping into yourself fully, even if it changes relationships. It means living your truth quietly and consistently. It means accepting that love can exist without carrying all the burdens. I also realized something profound. My family and life itself had been trying to teach me this all along. Every challenge, every expectation, every demand for strength, it was not punishment. It was preparation, not for endurance alone, but for discernment, for empathy, for the ability to love without losing yourself. I still feel moments of sadness. Old habits die slowly. There are times I long for the approval I once chased, or the ease of knowing my role was clearly defined. But now, I know that longing doesn't dictate my life. I allow it to exist, acknowledge it, and then return to what matters: presence, honesty, balance. I look at my life differently now. I measure success not by what I've done for others alone, but by the integrity with which I live my own life. I measure love not by sacrifice alone, but by how authentic it is. I measure strength not by endurance, but by self-awareness and compassion. And I can say this with clarity. The man I have become is not weaker than the son I once was. He is wiser, fuller, and finally free. I have learned to embrace the paradox of life, that love and self-preservation are not opposites, that boundaries do not equal distance, that choosing yourself is not abandoning anyone. It is liberation. And in that liberation, I have found something extraordinary: the ability to live without fear of failing others while still honoring them. The ability to care deeply without losing my own identity. The ability to be strong, soft, human, and real, all at the same time. I wish I could tell my younger self this. I wish I could explain that the quiet moments of reflection, the difficult choices, the courage to step back, it all leads somewhere worth reaching. That self-respect is not selfish. That boundaries are not betrayal. That you are allowed to be whole, even as you continue to love others. I also wish I could tell anyone listening now this simple truth: you are enough. Even if you've been invisible, even if you've been silent, even if you've been carrying too much, even if the world doesn't see the weight you've held, you are enough. Choosing yourself is not the end of love. It is the beginning of life. And living your life fully, with compassion for yourself and others, is the strongest kind of strength there is.